So Carl Showalter is investing in internet. He's actually at general partner at Opus Capital. He is investing in internet and data communication startups and brings more than 12 years of operating experience to Opus. Clearly, I'm reading this from their website, so you can do the same. He was previously partner at Lightspeed Venture Partners. Prior to this, Carl served as a vice president of marketing at Juniper Networks, where he built and led a global marketing and product management organization. Before that, he was vice president of dial and broadband services for UUNet, overseeing a 300-person, $1 billion revenue division. And there's more, and you can read it later. So that's Carl, and he's terrific and a good friend of ours as well. Next to him is Jeff, a very close friend of ours. He's a chief executive officer and founder of Trovix, a great company that many people use today when you're in the HR business. It was sold to Monster. He has over 20 years of experience building and managing high-tech teams and is the founder. Well, I already said that. Anyway, so that's Jeff, and he's really funny, and you guys will really enjoy the presentations. So I'm going to hand it over to Carl, and if anybody has a hard time hearing, just you raise your hand, and we'll adjust. And and sorry, Ben, I've already introduced, but Ben is representing DLA, and he's got a really cool call to make. They're doing an M&A, so he's got to go soon. Did you want to say anything before you go?
Yeah, just thank you all for coming tonight. It's great to see such a great turnout, and I'll be back down a little later and happy to answer any questions you may have on anything that's cooking from a legal perspective.
Great, thanks, Ben.
So okay. I won't take it personally because Ben sits in one of the board meetings of the companies I work with, and he's tired of hearing me talk, so he found a reason to get out of here tonight.
Okay, great. Carl, it's all yours.
Okay, so good evening. I was asked to speak a bit about getting your startup started, the cap table, who gets what, how you just split it up, what are the considerations you have to have. So I've come up with 3 rules, and I'll go through the rules and some of the aspects of those rules and so forth. First, I'll start with the obligatory Opus Capital advertisement. We're early stage investors located over on Sand Hill Road. We raised funds of approximately $200 million. The last one we raised was about 9 months ago. And we focus on very early stage technology companies across IT. So that's a number of spaces, including wireless mobile, internet, enterprise application software, infrastructure software, and actually semis as well. There are 4 of us that are partners at the fund. If you look at the backgrounds, my partner Dan was an early founder of a company called Electronic for Imaging. Back in 1989, he was the founding VP of engineering, and after they went public, he became the public company's CEO. He then took a year off in 2000, which is probably a good year to take off, and then started a company called Decrew in the storage and security space, which he sold to NetApp for $300 million in 2005 before joining us when we founded Opus in 2006. My other partner, Bob Borchers, again, an engineer, undergraduate and graduate engineering, spent time at a startup. The startup was bought by Nike. He was then at Nokia, and then joined a company in Cupertino back in 2004. He was hired as the senior director of iPod ecosystem, and he was there 2 weeks, and some guys named Steve Jobs came down and said, actually, we're building a phone, and you're the product manager. So he spent 5 years doing the senior director of product marketing for the iPhone and joined us about 2 years ago. And my last partner is Gil, who's been investing for about 27 years at Weispeck and Greer Venture Partners, at Lightspeed, and then helped, along with me, found Opus in 2006. And he previously spent two different startups, one he sold to Lockheed and one that he sold to another company back in the 80s. So we've all been in startups, and as you can see, many of us have been more time in startups than in venture, but we're learning this venture thing and really enjoying working with early stage companies. That's the end of the advertisement. Now it's time for our sponsor. Some of the cap table considerations. First and foremost, when you're thinking about putting together a company or starting a company and thinking about the capitalization table, get a lawyer involved very early. And I'll say what I mean by more about that, but there are so many mistakes you can make that you don't even know you made until it's time to sell the company, and then you realize what some of those mistakes really are. So get a lawyer involved very early in the process. Number 2, carefully consider the participants. Think about who the founders are, who actually are founders, how do you want to treat other employees, what kind of investors you want to take at what period of time, and then how you want to treat others, contractors, board members, advisors, and so forth. And finally, think about the long-term structure as well as the initial structure. it tends to be at many times that when we see a startup at the Series A point, the founders have spent a lot of time optimizing the Series A, not necessarily thinking about the fact that there may be a Series B and a Series C and what that's going to do to them and do to the employees in terms of dilution and structure and so forth. So I think these are the three areas I want to cover this evening. I'm happy to take questions at the end, or if you feel like asking questions in the middle, if it's allowed, you can do that.
Absolutely.
So rule number one is involve a lawyer. I would speak to a lawyer very early in the process. Most of them will help you incorporate and discuss the cap table for very little cost. You know, these lawyers are, you know, here to help you. The most important rule I can state is when you're starting a company and as you start the early process, don't verbally commit equity to anyone. Verbal can be a contract, and you know, whether you've seen the Facebook movie or the other real-world experiences, once you start talking to people about, hey, if you do this, I'll give you some equity, maybe I'll give you 2% of the company or something, that can become binding over time. And it really only rears its head when your company becomes valuable. We had a company that we invested in a couple of years ago, and a large company bought it, and it was a really good outcome. And as the deal is starting to close, suddenly we start hearing from people who, the founder, who was 28 at the time, had said, hey, when I started the company, if you do this, you get some equity, you get some equity. And the problem is that it's impossible to prove sort of a conversation that happened between two people. And so it's better if you do everything in writing, nothing verbally, and you consult a lawyer in the process to make sure you're clean. Because the worst time to try and deal with these kind of things is when a large company is trying to buy you and they want it all clean, and in some ways you end up paying some blackmail just to make it go away, as opposed to try and litigate it or work through it, because you don't know how long that deal is going to be on the table. Also, take some care about, you know, how you structure the cap table before you speak to investors. Now, depending on the types of investors, whether they're friends and family, whether they're angels, super angels, mega angels, or VCs, they each will have their own view of the cap table. So think about it and put it in a flexible format that you know, consulting with a lawyer that will be adaptable to likely what they want to do with regards to their structure. The other piece of that is, you know, I see lots of times, you know, founders come to me, they're looking to raise Series A, and they've been working on the company themselves for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and they want to come up with very special vesting for themselves, which means all the shares are already theirs. They want to come up with special accelerations where if in fact their company's bought, they get everything right away. There's a bunch of sort of non-best practices that get implemented that we end up having to sort of negotiate and work through. And my advice here is just get advice from your attorney as to what is best practice, what is a reasonable thing to do. There's a fair point at which for some of your work you should be credited for, but from us, we're about to put money into your company, so we want you to be tied to the success going forward. We don't want you to be able to sort of bail out right away because we're backing you. So there's this combination of fairness that lawyers can give you good advice on. Clearly, you know, we're on one side of the table and you're on the other side of the table, and having somebody sort of give you some insight into best practices can be very helpful. So now the second rule is a multi-part rule, depending on the different folks. Who are the cap table participants and how should they be treated? Let's start first with the founder. You know, who is a founder? You know, there's, you know, lots of times companies that have done well have many, many founders. But what really matters is at the very early stage, who are going to be founders and who are going to be employees, and how do you differentiate those? The other question is, how many founders should you have? How many is too few? How many are too many? I read a recent MIT study that said sort of the sweet spot of founders is between 2 and 4. Not sure whether that's right or not, but that's one person's opinion. Generally, you can do it with one founder, but it's nice to have a bit of a yin and a yang. And if you get more than 4, it starts getting complicated, particularly when you're trying to divide up the founder piece of the equity. One of the other aspects is, let's say you have 4 founders. Does it really make sense to divide it equally 4 ways, or should you think about different ways of doing it? The challenge that I've come across with founders, and I've had companies where 4 founders have divided it equally, which is fine, but as long as they understand that as time goes on, they're not necessarily going to be equal roles in the company, and they're not necessarily going to, if there's additional equity granted, it may not be continue to be equal, depending on contributions, depending on whether they're still with the company and so forth. And so there's a little bit of my preference, which is breaking that equality early is better, so you don't set this this sort of emotional issue of, gee, when are we going to sort of no longer all be equal? And the other piece of it is, how do you think about each motivation of the founder? So, for example, what is the kind of company that you're each hoping to build? Are you trying to build something that gets bought in 3 to 5 years for a bunch of money? Are you trying to build an enterprise that you can show your grandchildren and take them to it? Are you trying to do something in between? What is the motivation? Why are you doing this? Why are you starting the company? What are you hoping to build? What culture are you trying to build in the company? And the reason I use this word culture, and I say write it down, is I've run into many companies which have been around for 2 or 3 years, and people in the company sort of loosely say, well, that's not part of our culture, or this is not part of our culture. And I ask them, so what are the 2 or 3 tenets of your culture? And they can't really write it down. And one of the things we had at Juniper Networks when I was there in the early days is we had 3 tenets that we had written down and that everyone knew and that we could use whenever there was a disagreement or a violation of them, so people sort of understood this wasn't part of our culture. And similarly, I would encourage you, when you find co-founders who are like-minded and who you want to work with, sort of agree on what kind of company you want to build and what are the key tenets of the culture that you want to drive. One of the other aspects you have to work with your co-founders is, why are you doing this from a career perspective? Are you doing it because you've always wanted to do a startup, that when you were 12 you had a lemonade stand, when you were 15 you had a paper route, when you were 18 you had your first software company? Is it in you? There's another reason I've seen where Mr. Smith or Mrs. Smith has been in a large company for a long time and is tired of getting passed over for promotions, so he or she decides the best thing to do is go start a startup. These are different kinds of motivations and different kind of drivers. Some right, I can't judge them, but be honest with yourself and your co-founders about what about the enterprise that you're starting, what are your drivers, what's important to you, what's important to each other, do you have a shared sense of values, do you have a shared sense of what you want to build for the company. The other one is, what's your magic number? I've had founders that come to me, and one of the things I like to do is separate each of the founders and say, okay, if I offered you $50 million today for your company, would you take it? If I offered $100 million for your company in 2 years, would you take it? Just to sort of get a sense for what people's number is. And I think it's less important that I do it and more important that you do it with each other. And also recognize that it'll change over time. But it's not just the number, it's also the time frame. Do you want to, today it takes 7, 8, 9 years to go public. So if you want to build a public company, that's an awful lot of, hanging out with your co-founders for the next 9 or 10 years. So you better like them and you better have shared like goals. If in fact that's not your goal, but you'd like to spend 3 or 4 years and be a bit of a serial entrepreneur where you want to get this company started for 2 or 3 years and then go start something new and have some shares in different companies, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's better if you're honest with each other up front about your motivations and your drivers. There's a guy I know who I won't mention his name because I'm on record, but he's been in the Valley for the last 8 years, and he's been a product manager at Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and one other company. Each of them have been 2-year stints where he's vested and held his shares. And I kid him because I tell him that basically he's a serial startup guy, and he's picking very well, and he's building a better venture portfolio than I am. So I got to start figuring out what his next company is.